3:04 a.m. The desert at night carries a silence that feels almost sacred. But Las Vegas after midnight was never about silence or sanctity. It was about illusion. Neon signs burning over broken men, cocktail waitresses holding their smiles through cigarette smoke, high rollers pretending they were kings, while mob accountants counted every dollar behind locked doors the public never saw. Standing right in the middle of that glittering machine was a man the movie Casino turned into a legend, Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal. Smart, ruthless, obsessive, a gambling genius who helped the Chicago outfit transform Las Vegas into a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the version most people know ends with car bombs, betrayals, and flashy mob warfare. What almost nobody talks about is the real reason he fell apart. His downfall was not caused by one bombing or one enemy. It was something darker, something much slower. Frank Rosenthal spent his entire life believing he could control chaos, and Las Vegas had a very specific way of destroying exactly those kinds of men. By the late 1970s, Rosenthal had become one of the most powerful non-made men in all of organized crime. He was not technically a mafia member because of his Jewish background, but inside the casinos, titles meant nothing. Power was the only currency that mattered. Born in Chicago in 1929, he grew up surrounded by horse racing circuits, underground gambling, and street hustlers who understood how money actually moved. While other kids memorized baseball statistics, Frank studied betting patterns, point spreads, and the mathematics of probability. He developed an obsession with numbers so intense that people who knew him described it as a genuine psychological condition. Gambling was never entertainment to him. It was mathematics, control, domination over uncertainty itself. He understood early that casinos were not built on luck. They were built entirely on human psychological weakness. Men walked through those doors every night, believing they could beat the system. Frank understood, down to his bones, that the system was engineered to guarantee they never could. That understanding made him invaluable to the Chicago outfit. During the 1960s and early 1970s, mafia families across the country channeled enormous amounts of money into Las Vegas casinos through Teamsters pension fund loans. On paper, respectable businessmen ran the hotels. Behind closed doors, mob bosses skimmed millions from the counting rooms before profits were ever officially reported to the government. It was one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in American history. Frank Rosenthal became the perfect casino manager for this world because he was not a loud, threatening gangster. He was clinical, cold, efficient. At the Stardust, the Hacienda, the Fremont, and the Marina, he transformed operations into genuine money-printing machines. He introduced innovations still standard in the industry today: sophisticated comp systems, data-driven betting analysis, detailed customer tracking programs, and sports book optimization strategies nobody had ever applied so rigorously before. Every decision, from the placement of lighting to the precise timing of cocktail service, was carefully engineered to keep money moving in one direction only. Frank did not just run casinos. He weaponized human psychology at an industrial scale the mafia had never previously witnessed. But the very qualities that made Frank so dangerous also made him deeply vulnerable in ways he consistently refused to acknowledge. He believed that raw intelligence could solve every problem placed in front of him. The Chicago outfit valued earners above almost everything, but it trusted fear far more than it ever trusted brains. Frank generated millions for the organization, yet many traditional mobsters quietly resented him. He dressed too sharply. He talked too much. He appeared on television willingly and frequently. He loved attention in a culture that treated visibility as dangerous weakness. The smarter Frank became, the more convinced he grew that he could outmaneuver everyone around him, including the very people supposedly protecting his life. And then there was Tony Spilatro. If Frank represented the polished corporate face of Vegas mob power, Spilatro represented the nightmare lurking beneath it. Violent, deeply paranoid, and completely unpredictable, Spilatro arrived as the Chicago outfit street enforcer. Officially, he was there to protect outfit interests and maintain order. In reality, Tony operated like a dangerous animal wearing a tailored suit. He built the hole-in-the-wall gang, terrorized local criminals across the city, and attracted constant FBI surveillance through recklessness that seemed almost deliberate. Frank wanted absolute control. Tony wanted complete fear. Frank believed Vegas should run quietly like a well-run corporation. Tony treated it like the Chicago streets he had always known, just with slot machines added to the background. Two completely different philosophies trying to coexist inside the same criminal empire was never going to end well for either of them. The deeper Frank climbed into the Vegas power structure, the more isolated he became. He trusted fewer people each year, grew more obsessive and controlling with every passing month. Employees described how he monitored every tiny detail with near-maniacal precision: dealers, pit bosses, sports betting adjustments, security camera angles. He operated like a man convinced that total disaster was always one step behind him. The FBI had already begun massive investigations, focused on the Las Vegas skimming operations. Hidden microphones captured sensitive mob conversations. Federal teams tracked casino cash movements with growing sophistication. Informants who had spent years inside mob organizations began cooperating with prosecutors. The government was no longer targeting street criminals. It was going after the financial structures that held everything together. Men like Rosenthal became more dangerous to the mafia than any killer because they connected entire systems that investigators could follow straight to the top. Then Frank made the critical mistake that accelerated everything toward its inevitable ending. He began believing he was untouchable. Television appearances became routine events for him. He hosted a local talk show with genuine enthusiasm. He gave newspaper interviews. He smiled for cameras and enjoyed the recognition that came with it. The Nevada Gaming Control Board eventually denied him a formal gaming license, officially banning him from operating casinos he secretly controlled through other men. For Frank, that public humiliation was catastrophic, well beyond any financial consequence. This was not just regulatory pressure. It was a direct assault on his psychological identity. Casinos were the absolute center of his existence and his sense of power. And now Nevada was treating him publicly like a parasite feeding off legitimate business he had actually built himself. But the real collapse was not happening inside courtrooms or gaming board hearings. It was happening inside his personal life, where his defenses had always been weakest. His marriage to Jerry McGee, the woman who inspired Sharon Stone's performance in Casino, became an emotional catastrophe neither could stop. Jerry was beautiful, manipulative, impulsive, and deeply unstable in ways that fed directly off Frank's own vulnerabilities. Their relationship operated like mutual destruction, wearing the costume of love. Drugs, infidelity, explosive arguments, paranoia feeding itself endlessly. Police calls to their home. The chaos in Frank's personal life mirrored the chaos growing around the casinos. Then came the betrayal that poisoned everything. Tony Spilatro allegedly began an affair with Jerry, while Frank was consumed with business. Whether every detail was accurate almost did not matter, because suspicion itself had become toxic enough to corrode everything it touched. Frank no longer knew who he could trust. His wife, his friends, the men protecting him. Everyone suddenly looked compromised. Men under that level of psychological siege began making serious mistakes. Frank became erratic, more public when he should have vanished, more emotional when cold logic was the only thing that could have saved him. The careful, calculating mind that had built an empire began operating on paranoia and wounded pride instead of the cold mathematics that had always been his greatest weapon. By 1981, the FBI strawman investigation targeted the Vegas skim with devastating precision. Surveillance recordings exposed millions siphoned from casinos into mob hands across multiple states. Indictments rolled in against Kansas City bosses, Chicago outfit associates, and casino executives. The walls were closing in from every direction. Frank understood something genuinely terrifying at this point. The empire was not collapsing because enemies had attacked it from outside. It was collapsing because the entire system surrounding it had fundamentally and permanently changed. Las Vegas was transforming from mob-controlled territory into corporate America's newest playground. Wall Street wanted casinos now, and Wall Street had tools the mafia could never compete against. The old methods, intimidation, skimming operations, hidden cash rooms, corrupt union officials, were becoming dangerously obsolete under sustained federal pressure. Frank had spent decades mastering a world that no longer wanted or needed men exactly like him. For all his extraordinary intelligence, he never fully grasped one brutal truth. The mafia only values people while they remain genuinely useful. Once they become inconvenient liabilities, they become expendable without hesitation or sentiment of any kind. On October 4, 1982, Rosenthal climbed into his Cadillac Eldorado outside Tony Roma's restaurant in Las Vegas. Seconds later, the car exploded in a massive fireball that shook the entire parking lot. Witnesses standing nearby believed with complete certainty that nobody inside that vehicle could have possibly survived. Yet somehow Frank crawled out of the wreckage alive, burned and bleeding but breathing, protected only because a steel plate installed beneath the driver's seat had prevented the bomb from detonating directly underneath him. Hollywood later transformed it into pure cinematic mythology for audiences worldwide. But the real significance of that bombing was entirely psychological. After that night, Frank stopped believing he was merely under professional pressure from enemies who wanted him removed. He became absolutely convinced he was already marked for death. And the most terrifying part of his new reality was that he almost certainly understood exactly who had given the order. Officially, the bombing was never solved. Unofficially, almost everyone connected to organized crime believed the order had come directly from within the Chicago outfit's own leadership. Rosenthal and Spilotro together had become catastrophic liabilities the organization could no longer manage or contain. The skim operation was publicly exposed. Federal investigations accelerated month by month. Casino regulators wanted Rosenthal permanently removed from any position of real influence. Together, these two men had created a storm that outfit leadership in Chicago simply could not control from a distance any longer. After surviving the bombing, Rosenthal retreated deeper into paranoia. Friends described how he constantly changed his routines and trusted almost nobody. His marriage collapsed completely. Jerry spiraled further into addiction, disappearing for days and draining whatever money she could reach. The tragedy was that Frank remained emotionally attached to her despite everything. That contradiction revealed the profound weakness hidden beneath his cold exterior. For all his obsession with control and statistics, Rosenthal consistently failed to manage the emotional chaos inside his own life. He could predict betting outcomes with terrifying accuracy, yet could never predict the people standing closest to him. The man who mastered casino psychology at the highest level never understood his own deepest vulnerabilities, or how dangerously exposed they left him. Tony Spilotro's story ended with brutal finality in the summer of 1986. He and his brother Michael were lured to a meeting near Chicago under the false promise that Tony would finally receive formal mafia induction, the recognition he had always believed he deserved after years of service. Instead, both brothers were beaten and buried together in an Indiana cornfield. The outfit was cleaning house with the ruthless efficiency it always applied when loyalty became less valuable than survival. After Spilotro's murder, Rosenthal understood with cold clarity what he had suspected since the bombing. Loyalty inside organized crime exists only until leadership determines that survival requires sacrifice. There are no exceptions to that rule regardless of how much money a man has generated or how many years he has given. Frank eventually relocated to California and later to Florida, giving occasional interviews and carefully retelling selected stories from the old days for audiences who found that era endlessly fascinating. But the absolute confidence that had once defined every room he entered was permanently gone. Beneath every public appearance lingered the unmistakable exhaustion of a man who had survived his own scheduled execution while watching everyone he had known disappear into graves, prison sentences, or the slow destruction of addiction. The Las Vegas he had helped build from nothing had moved on entirely without him. New towers replaced old ones. Corporate logos replaced mob nicknames on every marquee along the Strip. The machine kept running with perfect indifference to the men who had once genuinely believed they controlled it. Almost everyone connected to that era suffered a catastrophic ending. Tony Spilotro beaten and buried in Indiana soil. Jerry McGee dying alone from an overdose in Los Angeles. Outfit figures spending their remaining years inside federal prison walls. The glamorous image attached to the mafia's Las Vegas concealed a far uglier truth. The system ultimately consumed nearly everyone who had helped build it from nothing. Frank Rosenthal kept calculating odds his entire life, with a precision few human beings have ever matched. He understood probability, human weakness, and the mathematics of chance better than almost anyone who ever walked through a casino door. Yet in the end, he never managed to calculate the one certainty that patiently waits for every man. He survived the car bomb. He survived the FBI. He survived the betrayals that would have destroyed most men instantly. He survived the complete collapse of the empire he spent his life constructing, only to discover, in the quieter years that followed, that survival does not always mean victory. Sometimes surviving simply means living long enough to watch your entire world disappear until nothing recognizable remains of what you once built and believed in. When Frank Rosenthal died in 2008 from heart disease, he passed away far from any position of power, living quietly after decades at the center of America's most infamous criminal gambling operation. The Neon Kingdom he once helped control had long since reinvented itself for a new century with no memory of his name. The house, as it always does, had won.